Hey guys, Mike Healy here. Thank you again for joining me for another awesome podcast. This is Cloud Investing Podcast. I am your host, and I have some really awesome guests today. Today, I'm going triple on you. We're going to have myself, Terry Tillaart, who some of you may have heard on one of the previous podcasts, and Michael Ashcraft. We're so excited to have you guys on here. Going to get a lot of insights. What we're going to cover today is some technical stuff, but more importantly, just understand that we are always moving everybody in the direction to encouraging you to take advantage of kind of the fractional ownership of the cloud investing stuff that we're doing with the data center units. You can reach out to any of us on here, get more questions answered. Also, you can go and get lots of information and data on the cloud just go to cloudinvestingpodcast.com. cloudinvestingpodcast.com. So all that being said, Terry Tillaart, thank you for bringing Michael on here. Why don't you take the time to introduce him, and then I'll throw any questions in there. You can go with it as well. But welcome to the show.
Hey, Brian. For some reason, Mike, this feels strangely familiar. I feel like you and I have done a few calls together. So that's fantastic. I'm excited to be here. So thank you for having me. And today I'm really excited to have our guest Michael Ashcraft, because this guy is a vet in the data space. And for a lot of us, like, I'm just learning about the whole space as much as I can. And I'm just like really thirsty for knowledge, being someone who is now invested in the cloud. And I'm just so thrilled about the potential. And Michael's got a fantastic background working for, hold on, should we say this out loud, Mike?
I don't know, you know.
He works for one of the big.
All right, you push your mic, you touch your mic and it turned off.
Jeez, that thing's sensitive.
It's
yeah.
sensitive. Yeah.
So he works for AWS, has been working in the space for a long time. So Mike, you can tell your story better than I can. So help me tell us a little bit about your background, and then we'll kind of get into it from there.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. Thanks, Mike, for having me on. Ultimately, I've been in tech since early 2010s, when it became cool, right? Really had the SaaS piece and done all that. So my background has been both in the SaaS side, and then now, as you mentioned, kind of in the big data hyperscaler cloud side. Have had a stint at Tableau in between there, and have actually started my career off at Yelp, right? Early days all the way through mass adoption and IPO. So have been in the space for 10, 15 years now. I think really the opportunity here is huge, and it's just getting started, especially, Mike, with the cloud piece, right? And the data centers. I think that's a huge piece of it. And being at a hyperscaler now, there's a lot of competition. There's a lot of things heating up, and there's a lot of different motions going on right now where people are realizing, hey, this is the wave of the future. I know even in 2017, I think it was like an Economist or Forbes article, it's like data's the new oil, right? And I think we've seen that just happen and change significantly over the last 5-10 years. And, that's only going to continue to grow as we have these conversations and technology advances.
Yeah, well, especially with now that AI has emerged, I think it's changing everything, and I think that's kind of where we want to kind of lean in on you on this, is like, you really have the bird's eye view of all the trends that are going on. So I think that's where you can offer a lot of value. We don't want to overwhelm people with the technical stuff per se inside the nuts and bolts of how the data center works, but like, what are some of the trends that you're seeing kind of going forward, and how has it changed since you've been in the space?
Yeah. So I think let's talk about data volume real quick, right? And just the money in the space. I think 2024, the big data market's expected to finish about 273 billion. By 2030, it's supposed to be about 450 billion, right? So you're looking, I think it's 8 to 10% compound annual growth rate, which is huge, especially when you're talking about such big numbers already. I saw an article as recent as yesterday. I'm not sure, it came out within the last month or two. It was by The Economist, though. And you look and you see the big players, right? Microsoft, Google, OpenAI, etc. To your point, Terry, about AI, those companies, just those three companies, have added $3 trillion in market cap from 2022 to now. However, they've only actually realized about $20 billion in revenue from AI, right? So I think the opportunities there, the hype's there, right? Like we've been accustomed to it. We've seen it in crypto. We've seen it in all these places. Well, things get hyped up. They go through their cycles, but I think this is bigger than hype, right? And I think the challenge is, how do people actually take advantage of it, and what does that look like? Some of the biggest industries that I think will have, and from what I'm noticing, are going to be healthcare. I think they're projected, just with AI and the industry adoption, really to grow by about 15% annually. You're looking at retail, which is like 14%, banking and finance. And a lot of what's happening, and I think where the power of, data centers, cloud computing, when you look at the overall landscape today, about 90% of all data is still on prem, right? So you've got maybe
Really?
10% at the hyperscaler
Wow.
type level.
Wow.
90% is still set out with other data centers. You think it'd be a lot more at this point,
Yeah.
right? Especially with the market. But ultimately, it's a huge opportunity still. And some people, really love the cloud piece, and there's a lot of benefits to it, economies of scale, innovation, not having to manage it. You start to get out of the business of working in the data center versus being able to innovate. But ultimately, there's a lot of opportunity. And I think where cloud is super important is, a small company is not going to be out here training large language models. They're not going to have, like, you look at companies, Tesla recently changing their Nvidias over to X. You're seeing supply chain issues. You're seeing all these things, and it's like, wow, they're building all these supercomputers to train these models. Well, that's not necessarily realistic for, I don't know, 90%, 95% of the companies that are out there. They're not going to be building and scaling these out, but they can take advantage of those opportunities by working in the cloud or working with cloud providers and cloud hosting scenarios. So I think it's very interesting, as you start to break into that, because ultimately, yes, we have our big players now, OpenAI, Anthropic, you have those. But as we start to see this, I kind of equate it to the App Store, right? You started out, there was a certain number of apps, they just kept growing and growing and growing. I certainly see like large language models, and what we see in the market is large language models being the same thing. Like, it's not a one size fits all. You don't need to throw, 1,000 horsepower at a problem where it could just be something very, very specific and useful and used, where you could use a smaller language model that doesn't take as much resources, cost, etc. So I think there's a lot of different shifts and things going on there.
I have a question. So ultimately, because I mean, a lot of that just goes over my head of what you said. I caught most of it. Because ultimately, what it comes down to is, when we buy these data centers that we found a company that's allowing us to buy the units inside there, and we get paid. And the number one concern that I had when I was looking at this for the first time was, we get paid on the occupancy of data being stored on these centers. In your opinion, how fast, like, is that going to be an issue, or is data increasing so fast that the centers are probably just going to automatically fill?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. It's an issue if you can't keep up with the scale. I think I saw something recently. I think Google, and I may be off on this, but I think they're investing another 2 billion in data centers in the Ohio Valley.
That's actually right up the street from me. Like,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah,
literally right up the street.
so I must be right there. So yeah,
You're right.
I
You're
mean,
right.
you see stuff like that all the time, and yes, right. They're going to need to be able to continue to handle that. But I think as you do that and you look at occupancy, that can mean many different things, right? So when you have a data center or an operation like that, there's different resources that are involved. Some of it's storage, some of it's the actual like compute usage. So like the processing horsepower, some of it's databases, some of it's networking, meaning the traffic in and out. And then you'll see there's a lot of general purpose type stuff, but there's also specialty stuff. So it really depends on the data center. And if you're a hyperscaler, they're going to continue to grow, right? Those investments are billions and billions of dollars, and they're going to continue to take advantage of it. A nice thing about those scenarios is that's where you can take advantage of the economies of scale, right? You can lower prices, you get more people on, you get to distribute what that cost looks like. Now, it depends on the customers you have on there. Like, as you start to move into these data centers, are they hosting everything in the data center? Do they have a multi-cloud strategy, or they have their own on-prem, right? So I think it just depends on what that looks like. But from the actual infrastructure piece, I think anyone who's in the data center and cloud hosting business knows like this is just going to keep expanding. And I think from even a data perspective, it's crazy because I think it's something like, I think the data volume captured in 2024 is like 149 zettabytes. Terry, I'll let you do the math on a zettabyte for the audience here.
Crazy.
But it's supposed to continue to grow, right? And I think by 2030, I can't remember what it was, and I don't want to make up a number here, but I think it was something like we're going to get up to like 600 zettabytes of data being produced in the next, 5 to 6 years. So, with that though, you got to remember, technology is always advancing. So as the technology progresses, there's better ways to store it. There's more efficient uses of operational processes. Chips will be a big thing, right? That's why we see NVIDIA. I don't know if you guys have seen that chart where it compares NVIDIA, Bitcoin, and Ethereum just going this way, and all of a sudden you just see NVIDIA off the screen, and you're like, okay, that would have been a nice. I think they're like 22,000% gain or something over the course of 10 years or something, insane like that. But they're the one hosting all those GPUs that are now putting out the AI and different things there. So I think there's a lot going on with that. But to get back to your main question of, hey, what does that actually mean? I think it means if you're invested in the space and you're in that business, you're probably in safe hands. No, as long as everything's operational, you can probably know things are going to continue to grow.
That's all.
Yeah. Curious, do you see that you said like 90% of people aren't even in cloud yet? So like what's stopping that? And do you see that changing? Like, where do you see that trend going?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of it, there's kind of twofold. I think a lot of it's people are locked into data centers. You have traditional big corporations, you're locked into their data centers. You've put out all that capital expenditure, building it out, buying servers, buying those units, employing the staff to keep the lights on, right? I think that's a big part of it. I think as you go forward, you start to see what the benefits are of moving to cloud. And I think cost, like we mentioned, is one of them, but the ability to innovate. I think statistically, it's like when you have big data centers like that and you're managing them yourself, like 80% of the times keeping the lights on, 20% innovation. Well, if you don't have to have that staff, focused on keeping the lights on, and you can move them to innovating, well, what does that mean for your company? Are you releasing new products? Are you, what are you doing and how are you going to market and how can you change that? I think there's a lot of maybe mystique behind like, what does it actually mean, right? And I think a lot of that challenge is, well, think about if you're the guy keeping the lights on at the data center. Is that a challenge for your job? I think there's maybe some fear there. That could happen. And then it's also learning a new skill, right? So you've got to up level to learn, okay, a lot of the processes and coding and different things are the same there, but what do I have to learn to be effective in the cloud? And how do I launch and deploy and manage resources and go through that process? So there's a little bit of a barrier of entry to that side in terms of the actual knowledge gap, but then also, hey, we're committed. We've got servers that we've got we've got bare metal servers we've had for the last 30 years. What do we do with that? We've got 3, 5, or 7 year refresh cycles on hardware. Are we waiting? So I think it just depends on a couple of those different things. But ultimately, I think as we continue to grow and scale and data becomes, I think we've all got these attached to our hips at all time, and you don't think about it, but what are those apps running on? Well, they're running on a data center, right? So as we continue to grow and those become a regular way of life, you start to think of what that looks like. I think another concern some people have, which not necessarily misguided, but security, I think obviously is always a question. That being said, in the cloud, whether it's AWS, Azure, Google, whoever, they have government clients, banks, they have all the security features and different things there. And actually, I think I read something recently where it's like, 80% of security breaches happen more typically on-prem self-managed stuff because
Oh,
there's just a lot more moving pieces, right? Versus think about if you've got hundreds of thousands of customers, you're probably pretty tight on security. Otherwise, those flaws would have been identified, sourced, and potentially exploited, right? So I think there's some different benefits to it as we continue to grow.
well, I think you just answered the question there in the last piece, right? Because if all the data breaches are happening to people who are still storing their data on premise, then obviously that's really expensive, really bad PR, really bad for the customers. They're going to move to something even more secure and just not deal with it. I think that's really the trend. Another question I had for you, Michael, because I think it's a great contextual piece that people don't understand, and you have firsthand knowledge of this. I think people question how much money do people really spend on data? What's an average customer of yours actually spending to be in a cloud right now? Like, give us some kind of context on that if you can.
Yeah, I think it varies. I obviously don't speak on behalf of AWS on this. This is completely separate. I am not a
Right,
spokesperson.
right.
We'll make sure that's known, Mike. Make sure that's known from the beginning. But as far as that goes, I think it varies, right? You have everyone from mom and pop SMB shops, just whether that's healthcare, SaaS, whatever. You'd be spending anything from $1,000 to $2,000 a month on cloud, all the way to customers that are spending $1 million a month. Um,
Wow.
plus, right? And
Yeah.
you got to think like, okay, that's big. But if you're running that, you're already spending that much, and you have your own data center. Well, you already, think about that. The benefit of moving to a cloud type environment is you can shift the capital expenditure, the capex, over to opex, which people tend to, boards, PE firms, most people like the operating expenditures versus, hey, I just spent $5 million on hardware. Here's the data center, etc. To what we were talking about just a second ago, for on-premise like breach, I saw a stat. It was like for an average SMB, if you have a security breach on-prem, I think it's something like $9.4 million is the average cost of what that looks like to remediate. And then if you look at downtime, like, a bird flies in, makes their nest in the top of the data center that you own, and then, all of a sudden eats some wires here or there. I think the downtime stat I saw recently was like 140K to 100 or 350K per hour of downtime for a lot of these customers, right? So there's a lot a lot that goes into it, and there's big expense. I know those numbers sound huge, but if you're a business who's doing 5, 10, $100 million, you know those expenses really line up. I think for SaaS companies, when it comes to like infrastructure and things there, you want to look at like 10 to 15% of your actual spend being infrastructure is typically, I think, what they aim for on kind of the balance sheet, if you will. But that can vary, right? If you're an AI company, obviously that's going to be more. Um, and it really just depends on kind of like the workloads or applications and services you're running.
I mean, if I'm a small medium business and I know it might cost me $9 billion because the guy I hired is asleep on the job, literally, my IT guy may not be qualified to really to do the high level data protection stuff, right? Like, it just makes so much more sense to go to a cloud in those cases. Like, to me, it's mind boggling. Healy, did you want to jump in? I didn't want to.
Yeah, I think what's nice to hear Michael talk about all this is being in the right place at the right time, that everybody's moving in this direction.
Yeah.
And to me, it's kind of called a clue, right? Like if we can, help people, because we actually have the opportunity to help people onboard onto our centers, which is cool. There's a lot of people that have actually recommended people to get on our centers now for their cloud storage. But we have the ability to own these things, and the income that they produce as a digital asset is just amazing. And just to hear you talk about this, I mean, it's literally how many data centers do I want, right? Because each one is a revenue generating asset that goes year after year after year for a minimal investment compared to what I normally would put some money down. I mean, the days of like investing into like a bank CD are a joke, right?
All right.
What's funny is I saw somebody talk about this once, that he walked into the bank and there was a small sign that said CD for 2% annual or something like that, or 0.1 or whatever it was. And right next to it was a sign like 10 times the size that said 7% on your loan, right? So it's like they just put it right in front of you, and people are like, oh, okay, let's invest in that. It's like nonsense these days to see people do that stuff. But I mean, I just think, Terry, you and I have seen this evolve really fast in what we've been able to participate in and getting these centers, getting to, we've got friends that have invested in them and stuff like that. And then to hear Michael talk about it again, it just reinforces the right place, right time with this thing. So, I mean, I couldn't be more jacked about it, Terry.
Michael, another question, like, I mean, just because we're always thinking from the investment standpoint. Like, I've been obsessed with the idea of passive income forever, and we always look at different vehicles. Like my father, my brother did a lot of physical real estate, right? But I look at like what would you say to someone who's thinking about physical real estate versus being a digital landlord? Like, where do you think they're going to win? You know what I mean?
Right.
Well, yeah, that's a great example. And actually, I was going to use that. Like, it's kind of like, do you want to own the house and make the money off renting it, or do you just want to keep renting the house? When you start to think about the data centers. Or another one I like to use, it's like, wouldn't you like to own the road as opposed to pay the toll fee to drive on it?
Yeah.
Well, you think about data and you think of the cars as just pieces of data flowing down the road, and you're collecting the toll fee every single time someone drives over your road. That's a pretty good passive piece, right? And I think you look at it in a sense that, when you talk about digital assets and digital real estate, it reminds me of NFTs and the metaverse and, sandbox. It's like, well, I've got my yacht, my jet skis in the sandbox right now. Well, you got to think like you're not investing in the actual digital asset, you're investing in the physical asset that hosts all of the digital assets, right? So you're actually taking, those real world pieces that people are using that fuel everything, hence this video conference, right? This podcast, everything there, you're owning that. And it's that piece where, it's kind of like, what's that saying? The gold rush from the 1800s, right? It's like, do you want to be the guy digging for gold, or do you want to be the guy selling the shovels?
Yep.
You want to be the guy selling the shovels. And I think this is what that represents, right?
Yeah.
Great analogy.
And how I mean, I don't know how you do it well, but like, give us some context on how profitable is this business? Like, what? Because it seems to me from every article and short video clip that I'm watching about the big guys, like when they're getting interviewed, I mean, they are friggin' all in on data because it's profitable as hell. Am I crazy about this, or?
No. I think obviously there's specific unit economics that are going to be independent for each provider and each service. I know AWS itself, I think, is a $92 billion run rate business at this point, was per the last earnings call. Don't like hold me exactly to that, but it's pretty close. I think they've got like 31% of the cloud market share. Azure's about 23% of the cloud market share, and GCP is about 10%. And then you have like Oracle and some of these other SAP and some of these other clouds as well. And those are just the big players. So you look at that and you do some math and you're like, well, that smells like $500 billion probably, you know what I mean? So there's obviously a lot of money to be made there. And I think that as we continue, it's not like we're going backwards in time where people are like, oh, no, I need to order more paper and notebooks. And applications and different technologies are only going to continue to generate more and more data, right? Even you think of crypto, the blockchain, etc. Well, what is that? It's a digital ledger. What is a digital ledger? Data. So, especially if we start to see that, and I know, real world asset tokenization is huge. You start to look at companies doing that. You see big players, Fidelity, BlackRock. I don't know. There's 10 or 12 spot ETF, Bitcoin ETFs at this point. Everyone's getting in the game. And I think from that perspective, it's not going anywhere and it's only growing. So, take for that what you will. I don't have hard numbers, but yes, it's profitable depending on the economics for sure.
Yeah, well, like I saw an article the other day saying I think BlackRock was planning to invest another $1 trillion. And to me, like I call it a clue. Like Mike's always says, And to me, it's like, obviously they're doing that for reasons because there's a lot of money in it, which leads me to another question, Michael. And I think it's an important one for a lot of people to think about. But would you agree with the statement that there's still room for the little guys to carve out certain niches and do certain things really well in the data space and still succeed? Would that be a fair statement?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the more niche you get, potentially the better, right? If you become I've seen businesses out there that host databases specifically for marketing companies, and they do that really well. Or you have AI or gaming or insert industry here. But it's just like anything, right? If you specialize and become the expert in that and you're able to deliver not only that knowledge, but the power and the performance, sky's the limit, right? And I think as we start to see that, cloud had the big general adoption. I think you had your early players that came in, got the bigger pieces of it, and then just like any industry and any business, things start to niche down, things start to specialize, and I think there's a huge opportunity there, specifically for companies that are focused on doing it right and really know what they're going after. I think going and just starting a plan and being like, we're going to be the catch-all for everything, and it's like, well, you're kind of behind on that. But I mean, if you do the math, there's still 90% you could capture it, but it depends on what you're really targeting and what you want to help to drive. And I think there's a lot of specialty that you can get into there.
Well, I liked being a fly on the wall when just listening to you and Joe have a great in-depth conversation about this stuff. And you probably had some time to think about that since then. If you were an investor in a cloud or starting your own cloud tomorrow, what what advice would you give to yourself about which niches that you think ought to be pursued? Like, where do you think there is some big wins to be had, or at least for a niche smaller player in the cloud space?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back, talking high level for a second. Obviously, first and foremost, like security is going to be the biggest thing you want to cover, no matter the industry, no matter what you're doing. And there's different compliance regulations with that. You get into healthcare, you have HIPAA, PII, you have different things there. Um, but I think, really, if we look at it, retail is going to be a huge one. I mean, how many how many people do you see on Instagram and everything there? You look at Shopify and it's like, oh, drop shipping and enter this. I'm a marketing agency and all these different things, right? So I think there's a lot of those current things, but I think retail e-commerce is obviously going to be a big one. Healthcare is going to be a big one. Um, I think AI has an opportunity. It's a bit of a challenge because it is so new and it's changing daily, weekly, monthly. So that's a place that if you can find your way, I think that's obviously going to be a huge one. But I think anything you're doing, that has the opportunity to go into the cloud, that is a business that needs that opportunity, they need the resources, they don't have it. I think the big thing I notice and the big thing I see is people need help with it, right? Like you, especially, I don't know, Mike, imagine if you go and you're like, I'm going to start my own business. Here's what's going on. I've got this great idea. Well, you need support. You need the resources. You need to know how to run the thing. You need to know, not only just coding the application or whatever, which I think a lot of people kind of lump that into. Well, the data and infrastructure is not necessarily all just the coding, right? It's the availability, the processing, it's all of these things. So it's being able to leverage that. So I think part of being able to do that with whatever sector it is, because I think most of them can perform in the cloud, and some of the ones I said earlier, Terry, healthcare, retail, etc. Those are going to be kind of the bigger ones as they grow, e-commerce, etc. But as you do that, really having the ability to shepherd those users in, help them to excel on your platform. Because one way to look at it is like you could look at a cloud provider as almost like a power company, right? Like how often, once you have your power hooked up or you have your internet going or whatever, how often are you switching power companies?
Yeah,
You're not, right? So as long as you're providing the tools for them to innovate, the tools for them to continue to use that platform and grow on it without having to seek third parties, and you can kind of create your own ecosystem, that's where you start to see the benefits. So kind of a roundabout way to answer your question. Like I think all companies can go into there, but I know those three are kind of the big growers moving forward right now, that a lot of people are looking at. And then obviously anything SaaS based. So not necessarily any industry wide, but anything SaaS based is going to be that's your bread and butter, right?
Well, that's great because I think Joe is actually developing a lot of his own SaaS software as a service stuff to match up with the infrastructure as a service. So I think that's a really good space to be. Let me ask you this one last question, then I'll hand it over to Healy and see what he's got. But this question's been burning on me. What's your advice to someone who's maybe a prospective investor, or maybe someone who's only put a toe in the water thinking about increasing their position, let's say being an investor in a cloud, and if their primary concern is like, are these things going to get filled up? And let's just keep all the assumptions out that the cloud's going to be run operationally correct, right? That there's people who are going to be working hard, treating it seriously, all that good stuff. Let's keep all those assumptions aside and assume that those are all check marks. Does a person have a valid concern like that these things won't get filled up? I mean, if the business is treated with respect, I mean, what do you say to those people?
Yeah, I mean, as long as you're getting your customers in there, I mean, it's kind of once you start, you keep going and growing. So I wouldn't have a concern at all. I mean, are you expecting the business to grow? Are you expecting any business to grow? Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, what happens when the business grows? So does the data. So does the innovation. So does the processing. So as long as you're saying, hey, does it run operationally correctly? Oh, yeah, sure. As long as you don't have businesses that are going under left and right, and that's obviously not the target. Like, as long as you're not signing all these people up that are sinking ship, like, it's actually the adverse effect. And I say that kind of tongue in cheek because, well, what happens when you start to be successful? You start to innovate, you start to develop more products, you start to get more users, you start to create more data, right? And for people looking into it, I would say, especially newer folks that are just dipping their toe in, think about all the ways you're using data or interacting with data. Like back to the smartphone example, right? Like what apps are you using? Are you sending messages? You're texting, right? That's data. Are you browsing the internet? That's data. You open an application, sending photos, like start to think in all of the ways that, like, whether you like it or not, unless you're that guy that's living in the desert in their trailer and only writes things down analog, like you're using data. Now, I know Terry, you're a big security guy and all of that. So that stuff is important, right? So keep that in mind. But at the end of the day, like that's where everything's going. Everything's going digital. You start to see like you said, BlackRock's throwing another trillion in. All of these other companies, like love it or hate it, you hear the United States talking about the central currency. Like, okay, cool. Let's put the political piece aside. But what is that?
Data, massive data.
Right. So I think even recently, I think you can do your passport renewal digitally now as well. Like, again, not saying it's right or wrong, but
data.
What does that create? More data, right? So you start to look at it and you start to see, hey, what is the impact here, right? And it's only continuing to grow. And I think it's growing faster than most people thought it would, and even faster than we can predict. And who knows what's going to happen and come out as you start to bring all these things online. But, yeah, I think that it's something where if you start to actually take that 50,000 foot view for a second and realize, like, kind of like Neo in the Matrix, where you can start to see all the numbers and everything, you're like, oh yeah, this is just data everywhere, right? I'm like, I joke, I've got my lights on, I hop onto my phone and change the color of the light bulbs. Well, that's still a data request, right? Like, so it is literally everywhere from small to big and everywhere in between. So that's kind of the way I look at it.
Beautiful. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for being on here. I really appreciate it. I try to shoot for about 30-minute mark on these. We just ran a little bit over, but absolutely incredible information, Michael. And Terry, you always ask great questions. Terry, would you kind of say we're in the right place at the right time?
Man, I mean, you listen to a vet like Michael, who's like has a lot of time in the industry, in the space, and he's not wrong, right? It's just data. It's like everywhere you look and think about, even if you haven't thought about it, the moment you do, you're going to realize it's data, right? And so there's a reason why the big guys are spending that kind of money. So I'm feeling really good about my teeny tiny little slice but I'm happy to be an owner, a little slice owner in the cloud. So, Michael, any closing thoughts from you? We really do appreciate your time. I want to just state that for the record, but really grateful for you. But let us know if you have any closing thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. Mike, thanks for having me as well. Always love to wax poetic and talk. But yeah, I think to echo your sentiment, Terry, you're in the right place at the right time. I think the opportunity's there. I think the opportunity's ripe, and barring Skynet and Terminator coming in, I think we're only going to continue to move in this direction. So definitely the space to be in.
Awesome. Well, you guys stay there for just a second. Let me say goodbye to everybody. Well, thank you guys for joining me again for another podcast. Really appreciate it. We are on YouTube, TikTok. You can find me on iTunes, Spotify, Spreaker, Amazon, all these places. Check it out. But again, appreciate you being on here. And if you need any information, run to the cloudinvestingpodcast.com, cloudinvestingpodcast.com. We will see you on the next episode. Thanks, guys, again for my guests. Appreciate it. Michael and Terry.